So again, my name's James Herring. I'm with Microsoft. Before Microsoft, I was a consultant for about 18 years, working for companies like Accenture, Avanade, and then I did brick and mortar companies, semiconductors in Greensboro, banking before that, and everything else. So I've been with SQL Server since it was 4.2.1 on OS2 Warp. Before that, I was an Oracle 7.1 guy. Do not miss it. And now I'm having to learn Linux. So it's lots of fun, right? So this is the 7473, Design Implementing Cloud Data Platform Solutions. This is not to teach you guys how to do it. It's to kind of go over what to focus on when you're doing studies. Has anybody studied already for this exam? A little bit. I would say that the normal time that we study, even internally, is at least 4 to 6 weeks. And that's really, it's not an exam that's designed to trick you. It's a design that has a lot of offerings and lots of different solutions based on the use case, right? So the breakdown starts out pretty much as the design and implement database solutions for SQL Server and SQL Database. And this part of the exam is going to cover 20 to 25%. You'll see in a minute that the third section is going to go straight back to some of this stuff, right? So this is going to be one of the major portions of the exam. The objectives of this actual section of the exam is hybrid SQL Server solutions. So you're talking an on-premise cloud-based solution where you may actually be using Blob Store for some data for some resiliency as well. If you have RTOs and RPOs, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just be aware about how they work, but you're not going to have to do any type of weird translations with it. The data load strategies, pay attention to that. Because when you're loading data into this for the exam, you're going to run into it, and it's actually in the next section, I think, a lot of Azure Data Factory stuff as well. And the storage optimization is important with that, right? We have solid state disks in some of the VMs, which is important. But some of the stuff that's coming, you don't need to worry about. Some of the SQL 2016 stuff, you may not need to worry about. And that's with a caveat, because these exams, and who's been in Azure? Anybody? Okay, so you guys realize that Azure is a constantly evolving platform, right? So new features come out, in some cases weekly. If it's in preview, you could literally write code one day, and the next day it's already deprecated, or some new feature comes and makes that somewhat impact. Preview, it's completely acceptable for them to do that. When it's in release, or GA, as we call it, then it's a little bit more patterned. One of the key things to always remember with it is go to the Azure website and look for the specific product, and then you'll see most recent updates in there by the product. So each product team has control over that. And they never do an implementation or a migration without actually putting it up there. Designing the security architecture, I'll be honest with you, some of the VPN, the networking stuff, I was a DBA for over a decade, my weakest part. And I was still able to go through this exam with not too much knowledge of it, enough to be able to go to the firewall, set the firewall at the database level or the server level, and set that up depending on if it was an IaaS implementation or a database as a service or a PaaS implementation. The second piece will be around the implementation of SQL Server on virtual machines. The considerations and a lot of the questions that you'll see, you really need to understand the scenario, the use case, and there are several of them where you've got to make kind of a best case scenario. You got to make the best choice on the decision. So if they're asking for something maybe that's low latency and they don't need DR or failover or something like that, then that's going to be part of the question, right? So there's no trick questions in here, honestly. You just always have to consider the questions as what is the best thing to do based on these circumstances, and not over-architect the solution. That's a tendency I have to typically have because that's what I do. So, but you're going to know a lot about provisioning SQL servers in the Azure VMs. The firewall rules, again, we'll cover that. And then configuring and optimizing storage. And again, if something's just been released, or it's still in preview, it's not going to be on the exam for at least 6 weeks after it's released. So it's nothing to worry about, but if you do take 8 weeks to study for the exam, which is not uncommon, make sure you revisit your notes and the Azure documentation before you actually go take the exam. Don't sit and study for 6 weeks unless you're actually doing it on a day-by-day basis, and then stop doing everything and go and expect to pass the exam. That's going to be a tough row to hoe, right? So some of the stuff to migrate an on-premise database to Microsoft Azure and configure and optimize VM sizes by workload, pretty cut and dry. Know this capability. Know the capabilities of being able to grow to that if you pause it, you're going to still pay for it, that kind of stuff. Simple things, right? And then the objectives continue, design a database solution. This is where we talk about design the solution architecture itself. And this talks about how to set up the framework, the infrastructure, the storage, the whole gamut, right? And then how to set up the keys within the environment if you want to have TDE, transparent data encryption, that kind of stuff enabled, what the requirements are, be able to understand that type of solution as well. Load strategies, again, this is kind of redundant from the last objective, but you need to know if it's going to be a one-time load or if it's going to be a scheduled load and know how to handle that. And I think I actually have one of the questions in here at the end slide that'll actually help explain that. Then implementation is a big piece, right? Because there's a big push to take people that want to move their CapEx, OpEx away from their infrastructure. So there's a migration effort to the cloud, right? So you have to be able to show them maybe a phased approach to that, understand how to do that, what tools are used, especially tools within Azure that may help you migrate your databases to the cloud. And those tools do exist within Azure. Let's see. A lot of objectives for this one, huh? And then design and implement data warehousing on Azure. This is where I said make sure I don't talk too much about SQL DW because SQL DW is not part of this exam. When we talk about SQL data warehousing in Azure on this, we're talking about the Azure SQL data warehouse that grows to about 1 terabyte, right? SQL DW can grow to about 6, 7 petabytes currently. So it's not important. If you want to talk about SQL DW, come to the next class or come see me after. Love to talk to you about it. It's actually a great tool, especially if you've got multi-terabyte databases out there. It's an MPP platform. But you also need to do the configure SQL data warehouse, know how to configure it. And again, this is the same type of stuff. How many DBAs we got in the room? One? Couple? How about developers? Database developers, architects, that kind of stuff? Okay, good. So this is kind of along the lines, right? I didn't show the slide on who it was for, but that's exactly what it's for. So this is like one of the scenarios that you could cherry pick. If you have always on availability groups, you want to be able to understand how and what the minimum requirements are for them, right? These links and these slides will be shared. I'll have to check these links actually. Because some of them are internal. Like I said, this came from the internal training materials that we used at Tech Ready to train our field guys as well. So you can rely on it, and it's probably in Azure, but you may just have to look, if you look at the extension here, let me see if I can point on this. Nope, I probably just blew something up. Yeah, so this actually goes to Microsoft Virtual Academy, and it's a video that talks about it. So you can get to it because I'm not logged in on my credentials here. So these links will prove useful to you for sure. But if you do have a problem with any of these links, let me know. Let me close that back down. Okay, so a key piece here is that you do need to know that you can have certificates, that you can use certificates, and then also VPN tunnels. When a VPN tunnel is going to be necessary, when it's not going to be necessary. And of course, when you're talking about replicas from on-premise to the cloud, a VPN tunnel isn't necessary to get to the replica set, but you may need a domain controller because if you lose your on-premise source and you have no domain controller in the cloud, it's going to be a little bit hard to authenticate, right? that kind of stuff. Again, this is stuff that it's part of it. It's not tricking, it's just straightforward stuff. Another scenario that you'll run into in this exam, hybrids, log shipping. Again, you've got a VPN tunnel, you've got the log shipping between the primary, secondary. There are rules with if you're doing any witnessing, that kind of stuff, and if you're going to set up a cluster, you need to know the rules around that as well. Backup and restore with blob storage, pretty straightforward, that kind of stuff. You can back up directly to blob store, restore directly from it. I would recommend ExpressRoute highly. If you guys haven't, do y'all know what ExpressRoute is? Okay, good. So ExpressRoute is the backbone to the cloud without going through HTTPS or HTTP. It's very fast based on what you have. Then when we talk about SQL Server VMs, again, we have high availability. Understand there are differences between SQL Server 2012 and SQL Server 2014, especially when you talk about replica and replica sets. There's twice as many. The other piece with the database mirroring, that has some limitations as well. And again, you'll see the links down here that'll take you straight to Azure. The best resource I can tell you for any of this learning outside of testing is going to be going to the Azure site and looking on documentation. If you're ever getting into anything in the field, or if when you're actually trying to figure out how much is this going to cost me, there's also a pricing calculator out on Azure. Has anybody seen that? It's actually pretty awesome. I have to redirect salespeople to it all the time because it's that simple. But understanding the limitations with the availability sets, how many are required for the replicas, because that will play into a factor when you're talking about sizing and performance and everything else. Here's an example. This actually shows the walkthroughs that are listed here, show walkthrough between Resource Manager, the classic type Azure, and then classic PowerShell. So it's important to understand not all the commandlets in PowerShell, but to read what they're asking you to do with the PowerShell commandlets, right? If they're telling you to set a replica, look for something that says set in the PowerShell, right? You don't want to do a create when it's asking you to do something else, right? And again, it's not a trick, but you will see several similarities within them in a lot of cases. And I know I have at least 3 questions on here as well. And this is really talking about the domain controller being in the cloud as well, where you've got the primary, secondary, replica, and then you have a witness server as well. It's not anything that you should have to know or have to cram for the day before the exam. This should be stuff you should already know. Okay, so disaster recovery, we've got several different types of recovery, and based on the class and the level of recovery you choose determines how often they're back up, how far back you can restore them to, and where they're going to be restored to as well. Do we have any government guys in here? No, your state, that's state and local. So government's completely different in the cloud, and we've got a FedRAMP cloud that's completely specific to the government. They don't actually have as much in theirs that hasn't been certified. It's been certified a lot, but not everything in our product stack in Azure has actually been certified to run on government. Then we have another one that's a Class 4 DoD that's coming up as well. So they have certain requirements as well, and I don't think it's not on the exam, but it is good to know that if you're going to set up something in the government cloud, that they have one that's in Virginia, and then they have one that's out in Idaho, right? That is the failover clusters. Also understand that when you're doing redundant structures outside the local storage area, that these Azure sites, the data center sites, are actually paired. So if you're expecting patches, or patches could be applied, you want to make sure that your paired sets are actually set right? So if they pair this one, if something happens, you can make sure it stops it over here before it happens, and vice versa. You don't want a bad patch to go out. I haven't seen any bad patches, but we do have, I haven't seen them on my side, but we do have them. So one of the neat things here, the availability group here spans multiple Azure subnets, and the client connection string here must say multi-subnet failover equal true. This is just for the geo-replication stuff. It's It's stuff, how many of you are planning on taking practice exams, practice set tests? Do you have someone in mind that you're going to use? Okay, I'll show you one at the end. That's one we use. They're really good. They're very close to what we have in the exams, and you can actually change them to test you just on the questions specifically, or you can have it do the scenarios. And it's really nice, really good about that. When we talk about service tiers, I kind of already mentioned some of this, but the service tiers with the, especially with the point-in-time restores, based on the service tier, you're going to have this. On the standard, it used to go to 14 or 15 days, but now it's 35 days. 6 months ago when we taught this, that was important because it may or may not have been on the exam, but for the standard tier, you need to understand that you can restore to any point within the last 35 days here. Are there any questions on that section? It's pretty basic stuff, just understanding how to build, deploy, and then get the data to it, right? Migrate and actually commercialize it, get it out there. Okay, second part is it's about 25 to 30% of the exam, and it is the management, the database management systems, right? Security specifically. So in this, you're going to cover the configuration of firewalls, and I've got a slide that'll show that here in a second. Managing logins, users, and roles, there are differences. Be cognizant of that. Assigning permissions, make sure that you assign the right roles and right permissions to the users, and understanding the differences between a VM versus a PaaS offering. Configure transparent data encryption, TDE, with the cloud. The Azure portal, that's actually pretty seamless now, but you can do it through PowerShell. Pretty much anything you can do in the cloud, you can do in PowerShell as well locally. It's a nice piece, and I'll just say, like SQL Data Warehouse, we can pause it, and you don't get billed when it's paused. You only get charged for the amount of space you used. SQL VMs, that kind of stuff, when you pause it, you still pay for it, right? So you can pause it, but you still pay for it because it's based on the DTUs and everything else underneath it. So knowing that kind of stuff is just good to know. There is a heavy push, I'll tell you, to make pausing available to the other ones, but when you actually have a VM that's being consumed and just pausing it, you don't really release any resources to everybody else, so that's why it happens that way. The implementation of Azure SQL Database Security, important to understand, especially again with the firewalls, managing the user logins and roles, permission assignments, auditing, row-level security, data encryption. I haven't seen too many that really go deep into any of these. They may cover them, but keep in mind that these are all adaptive tests. The way the adaptive tests work is they don't take points away from you. You've got a point per question, and once you achieve the passing score, then you achieve a passing score. But the bigger thing to remember is that if it's a multi-part question, if you miss one of those, that still counts as a point that you didn't get. So, which kind of sinks, right? I mean, if you got 5 things that you got to move over in the right order, and you get one out of order, you're gonna leave one off, you miss the whole thing. It'd be nice to get at least 80% for that question, right? But it's not the way it works. Okay, when we were talking about the securing the database with the firewalls, this is where it's really talking about where you can actually grant through a firewall rule someone access to a database without granting them access through the firewall to the server, and that user can still get in through the database. It's not a big deal, but there are a few questions that relate to that, and you just need to understand that there are different rules that may not, like an on-premise situation, make sense, but in the cloud they do, because we start at a different level, right? We start at the master. You don't have access to the server physically in a PaaS type environment, so you start from master versus server level access. Some of the configuration portals, if you've seen Azure, you've configured it. I'm sure you guys have all seen this over here on the right. I actually found out I have a laser thing, so don't want to shoot anybody else. So over here on the right, it's pretty easy. Has anybody not used this before to configure a firewall? That's good. that kind of stuff. Understand that the Classic portal is being deprecated. There's certain tools in Azure that aren't going to allow it to be deprecated fully for some time. When I say sometime in Azure, that just means maybe a quarter. We're not talking about 2 years. Azure ML is one of those that has a portal that's built on the old platform. So it's going to be around for a bit. So everything that you can still see in the new portal, you can still see in the old portal. But there's new features in the new portal that don't exist in the old portal, of course. So understanding that. Some of the firewall configuration, you have a lot of options here. You can use PowerShell to configure it. You guys use PowerShell a lot? The developers probably do, right? No? PowerShell is still one of those things that's amazingly not being adopted as much as I think we expect it to do. Internally, we use it quite a bit, especially if you want a repeatability pattern and everything else. And it just simplifies things, right? The commandlets, there's a lot of them, and I think that may be the daunting piece. Some of the naming isn't always the best, and then when they re-add different pieces, elements, the deprecation sometimes confuses people too. The T-SQL, probably a lot of people in here understand T-SQL quite well. You can also configure it through T-SQL, of course, here. When we have the zeros, we're just basically saying it's an Azure to an Azure connection through the firewall. And then an external IP address, we're going to actually have the firewall rules and all that set up. And then you can also do it through REST API, which is kind of nice as well to enable it to be exposed to other outside apps that are Java or whatever. They can be pretty much anything can handle a REST API. They can be configured to handle it as well. What I would say is what's important here is if you don't want stuff exposed through the REST API, make sure it's not exposed through the REST API. It's pretty easy to do in the most cases because it typically has a pretty secure key to get to those, like a 256-bit key to get through it. So hacking it's going to be next to impossible, but you still need to have the port that's open to it as well and the IP address. The security admin, and you know what? I forgot to press the timer. So keep me honest here. The security, database security administration is a little bit different. Again, I was talking about the Azure SQL database. You have the master database that you start from. Some of the logins are a little bit different. You'll see a little thing here, the parameter limitations, and must be connected to MasterDB to do the create login, alter login, drop login, all that stuff. And it's the same with SQL logins as well. So it's a little bit different. You've got the DB creator fixed database role for the server level inside the VM SQL server. And then Azure, you have the DB manager database role. So if you're on like a V12, that V12 could be utilized for something like a SQL data warehouse as well. So you start from the database level. You always connect to that database level. And this actually has a good link on that as well. This is one of those things I was talking about with the always encrypted. There's a column setting that says column encryption setting equal enabled in the connection string for the usage. But back when we first did this in July, this had just went GA. So it could possibly be on the test at the time, but I can assure you that this is going to be on the exam. Whether or not you get that question may depend on whether it's adaptive or not. But understanding the always encrypted as part of security is important. Also be aware that there's an Azure Key Vault that is an option to you that wasn't an option before versus just having Windows certificate stores. So, and there's links in here as well for those. The Key Vault may offer more flexibility going forward, so that's a good thing. And then the always encrypted, this gets really into the understanding of what and what should not be always encrypted, what the data types. If you have something that's a bit flag and you set the deterministic, that may actually be a bad thing, right? Because if you have a 0, 1, or null, you're going to have the same pattern being repeated. And if you're looking at machine learning, a lot of the cases we may have will probably have a propensity to be either null in most cases or negative, versus positive, which will be a smaller percent unless they use SMOD on top of it. But in the data that's physically stored, it would be pretty easy to determine that this key, this encrypted key, actually equals null, which could be bad. But where it actually does make sense to do it is that you can use it for query performance. So you can actually use those encrypted query keys in your where and your join clauses to actually help with performance without having to unencrypt it to get the data set. No partition elimination or anything like that. It's just another way to do that. Database dynamic data masking, important here to understand how a credit card number might be masked versus a social security number. I don't think the credit card that I've seen, like if you have an Amex, you know, there's a different format for an Amex versus a Visa versus that. I don't think it really takes into play that. The mask is generic, and it's always going to typically show 1, 2, 3, 4 as the last 4 numbers. So be able to understand that. And then, of course, you have the custom masking piece as well. Understand how to kind of set that up without having to go into too much detail. And know who can do that type of masking, right? Be it the database admin, server admin, or security officer roles, which is an important piece to know from a DBA perspective of not over-granting permissions to people as well. Sorry, forgot about the mic. So if you look, we're back to the design, high availability, and disaster recovery and scalability. And it's yet another 25 to 30%. So you can bet that understanding the disaster recovery and high availability in this exam is very important. It's going to cover at least 50% of the entire points on it. And this talks more about the design and implementation, which is key, right? We're not just designing the architecture, but we need to know how to implement it as well and be able to answer questions around implementation. And this talks about a hybrid versus just an on-prem. On-prem completely, you can just forget. But if it's a hybrid or a cloud, then it's going to be relevant to this as well. Scalable solutions are important. You want to understand the DTUs, how they scale, what their limitations are, and what the price point is. And I think I have a slide for that. Yeah, I do. So be able to design a scale-out solution, understand when, and then also understand that there's tools to help planning for scale-out and what your recommendations should be as well, which I'll show as well. So, and then of course, design and implement SQL database recovery. That goes into the type of copying and exporting databases, the self-service restore, where they can go back and revert to a certain database without writing everybody else. And this is the Elastic database pools. You guys have probably seen this, right? Hopefully. Okay. This is what I was talking about when you want to understand what the limitations are with the basic versus the standard and then the premium Elastic. Because once they get to that maximum point, then you have to do something. What's cool though, and let me jump ahead, I won't jump ahead. What's cool though is that there are, again, where you can monitor the performance of your databases that are in production, and there's a recommendation advisor that'll actually tell you you only need 25 DTUs based on the current usage for the last 35 days and that type of thing. So, and we cover that in the next section, but it is important because it plays an important role in your design, especially when you're talking about implementation of your solutions. The supported configurations for database replication, it can be an instance of SQL running on premises or an instance running in Azure Virtual Machine. And see, I almost went into Data Management Gateway, which is the next one, but because that's important as well. SQL database can only be a push subscriber of a SQL publisher. And the distribution database and the replication agents cannot be placed on SQL database. And why would that be? Anybody? Has to do with server level control, right? So where they're published at, who the distributor is, and everything else. So snapshot and one-way transactional replication are supported within that. So, you know, when you set up a distribution or a replication, you actually have to build package that basically says I want to distribute these, keep them on transactional replication, and then I have to be able to push it out. But after I build that, I actually have to populate it. And I don't have the ability on that server to do that population from the level of security that I have. That's really the big piece about that. Peer-to-peer transactional replication and merge replication are not supported, which would kill me in some cases because I'm used to using a transactional replication in an OLTP environment religiously. Merge, not so much because of the key problem that still persists after 20 years, but that's just part of life. You want to understand the versions of publisher and distribution. Distributor must be. I think going to the library here is probably the best bet for that. One of the biggest things I've seen, and you're likely to see in the tests, is SQL 2008 R2, which is still a pretty commonly run database. People are moving to SQL 2012 versus 2014 when they should probably be thinking about 2016, right? There is a state where you have to get from one to the other before you can migrate next. Understand what the ramifications of those are, and integration testing and validation and all that stuff before you deploy. And I think that's all I'll say about that. But the monitoring and managing troubleshooting. You guys use DMVs heavily as DVAs? Or do you use tools that utilize DMVs heavily? Yeah, so some of those tools, I'll be honest with you, they're coming, which is good. I've seen more and more people. Even if you're looking at CDC, change data capture, there's some pretty mature tools out there that handle that kind of stuff. What we're trying to get impart on people within this type of certification is to understand the inner workings, not the base level workings, but to be able to understand it from a logistical perspective, right, of what can and can't be done. So with the monitoring and troubleshoot SQL Server VMs on Azure, you have the capability to monitor database and instance activity. And you can do it with DMVs or DMFs, the dynamic management functions, or DMVs, dynamic management views. Understand that if you go to, again, SQL DW, that they are different. We have something like a DVCC, PDW show space used versus DVCC show space used, right? We do the same things. You want to be able to monitor and troubleshoot the SQL database, the activity using DMVs and DMFs, and their performance and scalability. And that's where we have what I was talking about a minute ago in the next slide. But you want to also be able to automate and manage the database implementations on Azure. And doing this with runbooks and automation and being able to use PowerShell is important. It's going to make your life easier. And then this is what I was talking about with the service tier advisor. This will determine the optimal service tier and performance level for your databases out there. And you want to be able to be familiar with this because it takes into account the resource consumption, the database size, a disaster recovery plan if you have it. It also examines 15 to 30 days of historical data at the 15-second interval. And then it aggregates it into larger 13 or 15 to 30 day analysis. It does require a minimum workload of 35 days of activity, so you can't spin it up today, run it for a week, and actually get response. It needs to run for 35 days. I don't think this is a trick by Microsoft to get you to consume it for 35 days so they can bill you for 744 hours, but you never know. We're typically not like that. So it does not take into account the uptime SLA. So if you do have service level agreements that are, say, 5x9s, we support 3x9s. I think you guys all know that. And it doesn't take into point time restore performance objective. So when you do use this tool going forward and you learn about it, understand that those elements may not be covered in that, and you're still responsible for making sure you do your due diligence on that. And then we have SQL database resource monitoring. You can still go to the SQL Server Management Studio, connect to a lot of this stuff, and do some resource monitoring. But the master.sys resources stats, it's based on 5-minute averages that are maintained for about 35 days. And I say about because we like to use that UTC, which confuses everybody, and we're usually 6 hours ahead or whatever. And then the user DB sysdm DB resource stats is based on 15-second averages, and they're only maintained for 1 hour. So one's a snapshot in short period of time, very transient. The other one's a little bit longer, looking at averages over the past 35 days. And the percentages are relative to the performance level, and they're all accessible. Actually, if you go to the Azure portal, it's one of the first things you typically see. And let's see. How am I doing on time? This ends at 3? I think you're right. Okay. We're actually zooming along then. Small group, so that's good. So query tuning. I've got 2 links in here with the performance tune on the V12 class with the SQL Server Data Advisor. I would recommend going to those and understanding how to tune queries, look at the query performance, and then using the database advisor to make recommendations and that kind of stuff as well. Also understand the DMVs that are around execution plans, sessions, all those types of things. They're going to come into play, not at a very detailed level. You're just going to be asked probably more around a scenario where it says which one do you need to use. And then you're going to see configuration parameters where I think occasionally I've seen it where a paren is missing or there's an extra paren or something like that. You just got to line it up because sometimes it's not trickery, it's just making sure you understand which one to look at. Event auditing, these are stored in the Azure storage as tables, and they're downloadable with Excel spreadsheets. What I would say is that with event auditing, this is a great opportunity for people like in my space to actually say, give us those logs, we'll put them in Azure ML. And if you've seen anything with the Azure ML stuff, you'll know that even on the server class and the infrastructure side, we're already offering tools that allow you to look for, say, intrusion detection before it really even becomes a problem. It's pretty cool stuff. All that capability still is available to you guys as well. But understand that there is event auditing, how it's stored, and that it's downloadable with Excel, because it will probably be a question. Am I going too fast? Good speed, okay. SQL database monitoring and troubleshooting. Understanding extended events and the differences between the two, right? So new catalog views. In this case, you may have sysserver event, sessions events, where you replace the word server with database. So a lot of those base catalog views remain inside the VM versus the Azure database. They just use database versus session, right? Or server, I'm sorry. And then the new DMVs, in this case, if you have something like sysdm exe sessions, we have in the database side, DMXE database sessions. So it's the same stuff, but it's just relevant to the PaaS type offering, right? The SQL database. And this is all covered in this article here. Again, you're not going to see, it's going to be rare that you see me have a link that does not point to Azure. It's my books online. And you guys, DBAs, books online is the Bible, right? So it isn't even the data warehouse side. Now this is with the monitoring pools. This I didn't see as much as relevant. I think it's, again, one of those things that you need to glance over, you need to understand, and by all means, if you can afford, I think they've got a practice test that's $99 that you can download, and you can actually set it up pretty nicely to say that I just want to see this types of questions on specific roles. Then you can actually just practice using that. So you'll get to see questions like this that will actually be covered on the exam is the important part. Well worth the $99, but we'll talk about some other things that may not make it worth the $99 here in a minute. So, now prepping for the exam. Who's taken an exam here before? Did you pass the first time? Awesome. So at Microsoft, we typically tell folks, Microsoft employees, take the exam, fail it, and see where you need work on, right? Since these are actually released exams and not in beta, because we do a lot of beta testing on exams as well, you get the retest option free, right, within a certain period. You can test as soon as 24 hours, but I think you have 2 to 3 weeks to actually take the exam again for free. So a lot of times what I do is, let me see what other tips I have. What I do is I like to go in and take the exam because there's several testing centers and some of them disappear overnight, it seems like. And the main reason I do it, even if I haven't studied for it, is because I want to familiarize myself with their layout. Because one of the worst things I have, you see this nice big monitor here? That's a nice thing to have. You'll never see this at a testing center, right? At home I have 3 27-inch monitors side by side. Never see a setup like that. I'm usually on a screen about this size, and I'll have a question that takes up 2 pages that I have to pan up and down, and then my answers I have to pan across, and it's very frustrating. For me, it's very frustrating. So I think you need to go take the exam in a lot of cases just to familiarize yourself with that kind of stuff it's going to take. This exam is about a 2-hour exam, typically. I don't know, compared to other exams, it's probably about the same time. The next exam, 475, is about a 3 or 4 hour exam. So it's a little bit longer. So, you know, it's good to be able to take that, especially at my advanced age, to actually know that I can sit there for 4 hours, you know, and do that. Now, there is the option for a lot of these places that you can set up at home and you can take an exam from home. But if you look at the requirements to take an exam at home, you have to empty your pockets. You have to have all of this stuff off. And you have to take your camera, pan it around the room. Nothing can be on your desk. I mean, it's really crazy. And then you have to have an ID and show them and all that stuff. It's just, my office is, it would probably take me a week to clean out my office just to do the exam prep, right, for them to do that. Yeah, and these you can actually see these are actually from Tech Ready. You will not be beat with a stick if you fail an exam, right? This is all learning. The only point you should be taking an exam is to actually acknowledge and share that you have deep knowledge in this subject and that you want it to be carried forward, right? You want to be recognized for that. Read the questions. The questions, especially the case studies, can be a little bit long-winded. But what I like to do, and I think that it's proven useful for me, is actually using, they'll send you give you a notepad and a piece of paper, and they'll give you extra paper as they go. But I like to draw, and maybe I'm just being old school, I actually do outlines of each problem, and then I prioritize things as I see, because a lot of times they'll say, you know, this is important, but this isn't as important, or they may not even address it. So that usually gets marked out. And then read all the answers, and if you see one that, you know, go back and read. It says it may have multiple answers. Sometimes they'll tell you there's 3 options, especially when you have to drag over in order the steps that you need to take. Have y'all seen those types of exams? Hate those things. Absolutely hate them. But not as bad as the use case ones where they actually do it because, and again, that goes back to the panning because you can't really pan and unless you take really good notes. It's kind of hard to do it. Now, there are people that will take, without reading the use case, they'll actually forward to the questions. And then they'll go back and read the use case to actually see, they get an idea of what the questions are, so they'll actually skim and look for those points inside of it. I've not tried that myself, but it makes sense to do it. Sometimes, and I'll say one of the important things for me with exam prep is to bookmark or to mark questions that I'm not sure of. You know, I think one of the oldest things you guys have probably all heard this. If it's your first answer, it's probably the right answer, right? If you're going through a list of questions and one says, oh, that's it, that's your mind telling you that you know the answer and you're second guessing yourself if you change that. More people are likely to actually change it from the right answer to the wrong answer if they go back and change it. If it was their first choice. Have y'all heard that before? Yeah, I've done it in my master's program, same thing. I was like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm not falling for that one again. Outside of that, let's see what else he's got here. I did borrow these slides, like I said. I was late in getting into this. So here's a practice question that we have up here. So here you have an Azure SQL database named DB1. You have an Azure App Service web application named Web App 1. Web App 1 is not a mission critical application. A prolonged outage will not result, look for keywords like that, will not result in massive data loss. You are designing a disaster recovery solution for Web App 1. And you have the following requirements. 1, meet an estimated recovery time of 12 hours. Provide an RPO of 1 hour. And remember I said you would need to know some RPO and RTO, at least understand what it means, right? And then restore is only needed during prolonged regional outages. Cannot require additional development or setup. See, to me, that is a pretty important statement, right? Cannot require additional setup. So this is one of those questions where I think it's good to probably skim, take a few notes, and then go to the actual question that's provided with that. So the question is, which recovery option should you use? Transactional replication, geo-restore, standard geo-replication, or active geo-replication? Any takers? I'm not going to throw anything at you. I won't even shame you. Standard geo, that is not the correct answer. It is B, geo-restore. Now, if we go back to the question, but you do see where this is where the ones that have told me to read the questions first and then go back to it, write them down, right? So geo-restore, if we look at geo-restore, I think the piece here is probably the restore is only needed during prolonged regional outages, and regional being the key word. So if it's a regional restore, then the geo-replication is going to actually allow other mission critical places to continue to go on. Then if it's a local, then they'll restore the local redundant backup and be good to go. I could be wrong, but there's the question. Measure Up is the tool I was telling you that we use internally. I don't know if I'm allowed to share that. Is this being recorded? Measure Up has been around for a long time, and if you really want to get a good feel for what the tests are, break out your little 14-inch monitor and do Measure Up on it, because then you'll get the whole panning atmosphere and everything else. But I got the monitor spread out everywhere. So, and I do believe that if you go to Measure Up with these exams, that it is, I want to say $99. If you go outside, I think you can also get them for around 150 bucks as well. So here's another practice question. We're good to go. You're an administrator setting up a new Azure SQL. Who says Azure versus Azure versus, I've heard all kinds of names. I speak American Southern English, ASC, so it changes every time I say it. So it's funny, I was with some French folks last week at a customer, and we didn't know what they were saying at first, because they were saying Azure, I think it was what she was calling it. Do you mean Azure? Yes, that's what it is. So in this case, you're a network admin, or sorry, you're an administrator setting up a new SQL Server database. Hopefully it's not your network admin doing it. That will be deployed on a new server object. After creating the new server and database, you are able to connect it to Management Studio from your workstation. You need to establish the connection. What should you do? Remember that slide I showed you about firewall settings? This comes into play here, I think. There's actually two answers to this one. And this is one of those things that I hate because I'm one of those guys that sees the first answer and says, yep, and doesn't even look at the second answers and third answers to realize that there's more than one answer. Yeah, it's actually A and B. So because this is the one where if they have access to the database, they actually have access to do what they need to do. And then you want to always add your database IP address to your Azure SQL database server's firewall settings as well. Any questions about that one? Nope. Good. I think we have one more practice question here. So you're the database administrator for Azure. Are these practice questions helpful to you guys to see what kind of questions are around? Measure Up, I'm telling you, is if I didn't get them free, I would pay for them. They're that good, but I would only do it after I actually studied through Azure and looked at everything, the documentation, because it's only going to augment it. And if you have MSDN accounts or access to Azure through your company, use that. We have a thing, you guys heard of the Microsoft Professional program. It used to be called Professional Degree. There's a data science tract. We use edX a lot. And if you go to edX, edX is a MOOC. It's a massively open online classroom. And 99% of them, you can audit the courses. You don't have to pay for it. Now, if you want a certificate that says, hey, James passed this class, then you can pay $49, $99, whatever, to do it. Our program, I think, is going to be around $500 to get the Microsoft Professional Program in Data Science, and that's just the first one. But if you want to learn about some of the stuff with SQL Server, basic syntax and stuff like that, it's really great because even if you don't go through it, there's a lot of case studies in there that are part of the exam, and what they'll do is they'll give you a case study. You go to Azure, you build the pieces that they are. In these cases, they're like HD Insight, SQL Data Warehouse, stuff like that. And then you get asked questions about, right, what's the answer to this problem? And in order to get the answer, you can't just guess it. You actually have to execute a query that you wrote and designed to figure out what the number is. So it's actually really good about that if you want to really learn it. That's all I'm about to say about that. But let's see. So you're a database administrator for an Azure SQL database for your company. The Azure SQL database is used by a web app, and the IT manager creates a new slot for this web app. You need to make a copy of the Azure SQL database based on a snapshot of the current SQL Server database for the newly created web app slot. And this is where I was talking about with Azure PowerShell commandlets. Read what they're trying to accomplish here, right? And then it's pretty easy, I think, to actually see it. So if you look at the commandlet here, the first top one, it says start Azure SQL database copy. What are we being asked to do? We need to make a copy of Azure SQL database based on a snapshot, right? So this is starting a copy. It's not creating a copy, it's starting a copy. It's not invoking a resource action. And then we've got a new Azure Resource Manager SQL database copy. So look at what the question is asking. And I think, to me, a lot of times it's really relevant. I think the thing that would confuse me here, if I didn't know it, would be that the first two appear, when I see it on a test, I'm like, well, one of them must be right? So I got a 50-50 shot. It's not right. What they're trying to do is throw you off just a little bit with the answer to make sure you understand. The answer is actually D, which is we're just wanting to make a copy of it, right, of a snapshot. So we're going to do a new Azure RM SQL database copy of an existing snapshot in this case, because you can see the database copies right here. So again, we're preparing for the exam. Review the exam topics from the guide, and the best place to go to, don't go to their third-party sites that tell you how to pass the exam. Fortunately, since they are adaptive, they're a little bit harder to just, I don't know if you guys remember the boot camps in the 90s and stuff where people would get MCDBAs and MCSEs. I used to interview folks that had those things, and when I saw boot camp, it went straight in the garbage can, because I would still interview them, but it was typically a short interview. The key to remember here, look at the guide. It's got everything in you need it. It has a lot of links in there, but it does require you to spend, I would say, even if you're knowledgeable, a good month, and get as much hands-on doing these things as you can, because that's going to build the muscle memory. The muscle up here memory for you, because a lot of times when I'm doing these where I have to slide it, I have to actually imagine the configuration module, or I have to remember, like if I'm doing Azure ML, I actually have to remember the left side panel that has all my options, and I got to remember the order. It's very confusing to do it that way, but if you've done it in practice a couple times, it becomes very easy. And where I think the testing exam, once you've gotten past that point to where you're comfortable with doing a lot of this stuff, the practice test actually helps you build that confidence, right? To help you say, that's where a little bit of memory comes into play, right? Because you don't have to know the exact thing, but you can remember that that's definitely not required. And reading the question, you learn to look for certain things with the practice exam. No tricks or anything like that. Schedule your exam out early off so you actually know that you have a date. And I like to put it on my calendar. I will wipe out my calendar. If you look at my calendar, I have an R hour that's scheduled because I write R code as well. I have a Python hour, and they're usually in the afternoon, evening, and times. Because in my role, if I don't have it on my calendar, someone's going to take that space on my calendar, and then I never get to do the actual study. So I do exam prep, or I just did the professional degree program on the accelerated track. I had time that was actually set aside so people wouldn't bother me. It didn't work, but it was an effort to try. It's easier to put it as private than they can. Then they're like, well, that's a private event. I'm not going to schedule over that. But I used to put like, I'm going to go work out at 12 to 1, and guaranteed 12 to 1 there'd be a meeting pop up every day. So nobody cared about that until I made it private. Use what you don't use. I don't know what that means actually. I think when you schedule an exam, when you say use what you don't use, I think that's just the process of elimination, right? If you can rule things out, mark them off, right? If you can see from like that commandlet that we had up here, if you can say it's starting a database copy when it's asking for, you need to make a copy, not create a copy, then I would eliminate those two, right? And then when we're talking about invoke a resource action, I dig sometimes into the names as well. And this one just didn't make any sense to me because it's talking about API versions and everything else, and it's just not relevant. So I would mark out the top three and then use the one that I ran into, just process elimination there. Know the GUI, know the code, that just comes from hands-on practice. You're not going to see a lot of, you may see a few GUI screenshots in the exam, but typically they're pretty mundane on that piece. And again, take the practice, learn where your gaps are, but remember when you do take a practice exam and you go back to study, don't forget to restudy all the other areas that you were good in. You don't want to go back and find out that you focused on the right things from the last exam, but kind of forgot some things from the last one. Because unless you do this, I don't have the ability, I do now in some cases, to do this every single day to where it becomes second-hand knowledge. And keep in mind, keep up to date. By going to the Azure site, you're able to keep up abreast on what's changed, right, in the last 6 weeks and stuff. And keep in mind, since these exams are updated regularly, because we want to remain current, there are things that if you go to some of these training sites that may not actually test you for something that's going to be on there. But by keeping abreast of what it is, set time of day. I don't know, I'm sure you guys all have busy schedules at work, but you know, Microsoft, we come from a growth culture, right? So we are constantly learning ourselves internally. My wife, that's why if I was nervous and speaking fast, I just realized my 21st anniversary is tomorrow. And I haven't picked out a gift yet for her. So plan ahead, right? It's funny. She's fine though. This is good. I actually get to be home for this one. So in this, we did the objectives and takeaways. We did review the requirements. I think overall, I would love to sit down and teach a class to actually go through each one of these and actually do this because it is fun to do stuff in Azure, especially when you can actually see value from it pretty quickly. Migration from on-premise to the cloud. I'd encourage you to play with blob stores. I'd encourage you to play with the different class of machines and to actually build a cluster. Don't keep them up and running because you're going to get charged for it, right? But build even if you're not on this, but if you want to build a Hadoop cluster, build an HD Insight cluster. It'll take 20 minutes to build, and then actually run through some Hive scripts. You can get some stuff from edX, like I said, and then expand it, grow it, right? Add a Spark cluster, add an R cluster. I wouldn't be surprised pretty soon to see R server for SQL Server on this as well, because it is in preview for the HD Insight stuff. So, have any of y'all running SQL 2016 yet? Are you doing any R stuff?
No, it's kind of like the
Yeah, you'll be able to leverage a lot of that. So the other thing is, if you've not used clustered column store indexes, look at them. Those came from my team. When we were in incubation, we came from MPP platforms. And I had a 10 terabyte data warehouse that I used a clustered column store index on it. It's a dimensional model with a third normal form staging area. And we're pretty agnostic to that in the MPP world. And by taking it, putting in clustered column store indexes, I was able to take a 10 terabyte data warehouse, compress it to 36 gig. And then I had any query dynamically run against it that would take them anywhere from 3 hours to 27 hours, execute in less than 7 minutes. So MPP rocks. So that's my password now. I'm gonna have to change it. No, I'm kidding. So do you guys have any questions? I think there's another slide here. These are irrelevant to this. But do you guys go to Channel 9? Channel 9 is a great resource for a lot of the stuff, even the emerging stuff. And again, I find it easy just to, I think it just, my going to school constantly for the last 20 years is I've just found it easy to set up time, even in the evenings during the week, to keep abreast on what's going on. It's easy to get complacent, but Azure's not going to allow us to maintain complacency. It's a very ever-changing, growing, and it's all based on the demand from you guys. So it's good that we're actually implementing things that you guys need. Slowly sometimes, but if you've ever been in a development shop, you can realize there's a lot of integration and regression testing that needs to happen on every simple step in code. So we don't want to create a cool feature and then break 2,000 customers or 200,000 customers. So if there's not any questions, I'll give you a bit of your time back. And thanks for all four showing up. Makes it easy, less pressure. Thanks, and you guys have a good night.